Last week, I preached on the difference between whining and lamenting. It was a sermon that I have the feeling that people listen to for two reasons. There were a couple times this week where I was in a meeting or in a conversation with somebody, and I would say something, probably about the sign or the banner, and they would say, "John, are you whining or lamenting?" So I knew they had listened somewhat to the sermon. It was also a sermon where people sitting next to their roommate or their partner or their spouse, it was a sermon where they would go, yeah. Okay. Just to kind of summarize that, the difference between whining and lamenting. Whining tends to be a little self-centered. It's a litany of blames where the person clearly feels victimized. They kind of stew in their own juice. You get the feeling you're just an excuse standing there in front of them so they can just spout. A lament is direct speech. It is directed to somebody. It uses the second person, you, and it has expectations of somebody doing something. The big difference between whining and lamenting is that whining really doesn't establish a relationship. Often whining makes us want to avoid the person that is going to whine. It makes us not want to ask them, "How are you doing?" because they're going to tell us. And we don't want that. So whining kind of destroys relationships. Lamenting establishes relationships because it has this direct speech and it has these expectations of the other person. So this psalm is a lament. Now, most psalms of lament in the Bible are of human beings lamenting to God. God, be God, do these things. We have our hope in you. We have our trust in you. This psalm of lament is a little different. It is where God is lamenting to the people. It's God who has the concern that God is bringing to the people. And so God is kind of wanting to establish or reestablish the relationship with the people. It's God who has hope. It's God who has trust in the people. Now, what is God lamenting? Well, twice in this psalm, God says, "You don't listen. You don't listen." There's a difference between hearing and listening. Now, I've had debates this week on which is which, but for the purpose of this sermon, I'm just going to define them this way. Hearing is when we take in sound. So we could be sitting in our room reading a book and it's very quiet, and then somebody turns on the radio and we hear the radio. Somebody starts talking and we hear that. Somebody turns on music. Somebody knocks at the door. The phone rings. And we hear that. Yeah. And sometimes we overhear sounds and turn them out. I no longer hear really the traffic on King Avenue. I no longer hear the helicopters that are care flighting over our house. I came home Thursday night around 8 o'clock and I heard a loud party going on north of our house on Michigan. Now, the difference between music and noise is whether it's wanted or not. And noise is technically unwanted sound. Now, listening is intentional. It's paying attention. Now, when I stood on my back porch and listened to the noise that was going on further up Michigan Avenue, I started to listen to that music. And I thought, oh, this is pretty good. I had moved from hearing to listening. So there's a difference. And God says, you're not listening to me. God's saying, you're not paying attention. You haven't set aside time to listen to what I'm saying. It's almost impossible to have a relationship with someone when we don't listen to each other. So, why don't we listen? It's the same old story. We know what they're going to say. There's a lot of yada, yada, yada to what they're going to say. We just kind of tune it out. Have you ever been in that circumstance where somebody's talking and you just kind of tune them out, and then they conclude by saying, so what do you think I ought to do? Well, what do you think you ought to do? Same old story. Sometimes we're just distracted. We're paying attention to our phone. We're listening to, watching TV. We hear the person talking, but we're listening to something else. And sometimes we're not listening because we're preparing what we're going to say in response to them. We've already got our arguments made. And sometimes we don't listen because we just know better than them. They're not worth listening to. It's interesting, in the last couple of classes I've taken at Ohio State, the professors in the first day tell us that they will not be putting their PowerPoint of their lectures online. And they say they do that for two reasons. One is, if the PowerPoint's online, there's no reason for the student to come to class and listen to them. The other reason is the PowerPoint is just the rough outline and actually just cues for the professor, and there's so much more to listen to than just the points on the PowerPoint. So, the professors are having a listening issue with their classes. What does God want us to listen to? Well, it's in Hebrew. God wants us to listen to God's yearning for us. Let your love be mutual. Visit those who are in prison. Visit the sick. Feed the hungry. I want to give you things. Do not be afraid. Know that I will not forsake you. Know that I will not abandon you. Know that I will be your helper. That's the kind of stuff God wants us to listen to, and so that we will have a relationship with God. How does God feel when we don't listen? Well, how do we feel when people don't listen? We get angry. We get frustrated. We feel discounted. We feel unvalued. We feel like, we don't count. I think we can say basically all of that is how God feels. God can get mad because we don't listen, because we don't want to be in relationship. God can be frustrated by that. God can be brokenhearted. God can be sad. God can be discouraged. God can feel discounted. In Psalm 81, the line after God says, "You don't listen to me," is usually translated as, "You don't submit to me." What that really says is, you don't have anything to do with me. I mean, that's really cold. I want no part of you. I mean, if Susan said that to me, I would be crushed. I want no part of you. If my kids said that to me, I would be devastated. I mean, if I said that to my kids, I want no part of you. That's heartbreaking. You know, I want no part of you. The relationship is over. Is that why God thinks people are not listening? So what does God do? It's interesting, God's response. God doesn't punish. God doesn't desert. God doesn't cause anything to happen. God just doesn't intervene. God just says, you're not listening, you want to go your own way, go your own way. We've had this experience as parents, as partners, haven't we? How many times have I told you to check your oil in your car? I'm not going to remind you anymore. I'm not going to remind you anymore. Just go your own way. How many times have I told you to check your gas tank? How many times have I told you you drink too much? I'm not going to cause it. I'm not going to intervene. Just go your way. This is the story of the prodigal son. The father doesn't cause anything. The father doesn't desert. The father just says, go your way. You have the freedom to go your way, and you live with the consequences. Now, God says here, I will turn you over to your own counsels. And then he says, God says, but if you want to come back, I will be waiting for you. That again is the prodigal son. I will turn you over to your own counsels. But if you come back, I will be waiting for you with the finest bread and the sweetest honey. I will receive you back. The God that's portrayed in this psalm, where God is lamenting and God is trying to reestablish this relationship of listening to each other. The God that's portrayed here is not a God that's stoic. It's not a God who's up there removed from us. It's not a God who's unaffected by us. It's the God that we sang about in that God weeps, God bleeds, God waits. It's a God who is very moved by what we do. It's a God who's very affected by what we do. It's God who suffers because we suffer. God hurts because we hurt. And God hurts because we hurt ourselves. And God hurts because we cause our suffering. And God wants us to listen for our good. It's a different God than we often are used to. It's not the God who's up there counting our rights and wrongs and keeping a report card. It's a God who is very close to us and wants to be very close to us and wants to be in that relationship. It's a God, in a sense, that we could say needs us. If God is about relationship, then God needs people to be in relationship. And in a sense, our listening completes God. It's a strange notion that we are that important that we complete God and make God whole. And God suffers until we come back to relationship. our listening is obviously for our own good. Let love be mutual. Know that God is our helper. Know that God will not forsake us. But our listening is for God's sake also. It's for God's joy, so that God's joy too will be complete. And it's only in relationship that we're both made whole. Now, I was at the monastery 2 weeks ago, and people, at least one of you, asked me, well, what happened at the monastery this year? One of the things that dawned on me at the monastery this year is, even though it's silent and nobody really talks, you'd think you'd get all this listening to God done. And it dawned on me this year that it is so, in silence, it's just as easy to avoid God as it is when there are a lot of distractions going on. One can read the Bible the whole time there, but not listen to God. Because you're distracted. You're thinking about other things. A verse sends you off into space. You can participate in all the prayers and not listen to God, not listen to what's being chanted, because you're worrying about, did you remember the last line? What are you going to do after this? Why is that monk, not here? Why is this monk here now? Is he a visitor? What is that person doing in front of me? All that stuff that goes on at church. It's really easy to not listen to God at the monastery. And one day I decided, I'm not going to go to any of the prayer services. I'm not going to read the Bible. I'm not going to pray today. I'm just going to sit under a tree and see what happens. And what I listened to, what I heard, was God saying, I want to give you things. I want to give you my love. I want to be your helper. Quit trying to take things. Quit trying to get things. Quit trying to make deals. I want to give you things. Just open your hands and receive them. As I said last week, I ran into a friend that I hadn't seen for 30 years. She would leave notes on my car. And this week I got a postcard from her. And she said, the postcard said, remember the lessons of the Abbey. Be still. Slow down. Notice. Be gentle with yourself. Take more naps. Take more walks. Listen. Receive God's love. Be that love. You can do this. Just be. And I thought, boy, isn't that true for all of us if we listen? Be still. Notice. Take more walks. Take more naps. Slow down. Receive God's love. Be that love. Just be. I think when we listen, we're on our way to that life. May it be so.